Let's look at another important process, and we're going to start again from a color image here and edit with Emulsion 4. And that is the wet plate process. Specifically, the Collodion wet plate is what we're emulating here in Emulsion 4. It's a beautiful process. It's something that you may have seen. I'm going to put a link actually to my history of photography documentary, which you can watch here on YouTube, in the comments if you find kind of these old processes interesting. But if you're just here just to make the process so you can go to print, that's also fine too. I won't get too deep into it, but it's an old process, much like the cyanotype. And it's called wet plate because you had to prepare your plate with wet chemicals and then expose it wet. You couldn't just have a roll or a sheet like we did on 4x5 film. You really had to do it prepared wet. So a lot of times you get these very gritty, kind of flowing liquids and chemicals. If you've watched some of the videos of people making artisan wet plates, sometimes they're doing very large cameras, even trucks being converted into these huge, large format wet plate cameras. They can be very beautiful and very rich. Now, the original wet plates weren't normally printed that large like we see in some of these videos, but the process is really cool. So let's go into here. And as always, we're going to start by running the base action in Emulsion 4, which is our platinum base. So let's run that. I catch a lot of flack for trying to get authentic looks of platinum and wet plate and things like that, but I love it because not only does it help us create more, it really pays homage to these old processes. And I hope that Emulsion 4 helps people be more interested in darkroom processes and film, in understanding where we came from and in merging those processes to create better art. I think that's really important. So when we're making these, we're really trying to make them authentic and put the tools in here to get a really beautiful look that's inspired by those classical looks, but that's also modern using our digital files. Here's the platinum look. It looks good, but we're going for a wet plate collodion look. Let's run the wet plate collodion 4 action, and that's going to transform all the layers and add all the extra layers that are needed to turn this into a wet plate look. So now we have the base wet plate look. And again, you can use it just out of the box, but let's dig into some of the layers that have been added in this, as well as what you can do with it. So you have your master tint adjuster. If you've seen wet plates, some of them are very mild and black and whitish, and some of them are very tinted. And again, just like all real darkroom processes, this depends on how the chemicals are mixed, the papers you're using. It's the beauty of the darkroom. And we're trying to imitate not the randomness, not so much random, but actually the control of having those nuances of how you mix chemicals. So first of all, decide, like in all of them, kind of how intense do you want your tone to be? And as you increase the tone on this, it's going to affect across the entire image. So you can go very low, and the more you crank it up, the more you're going to get kind of that deep, rich wet plate look. Now, if you look down here, in plates and mods, you can see that other layers have been added. This is actually a fairly complex effect, not one I would want to do manually. It's not one I would use much if I had to do it manually because there's a lot of layers to be built, and I'm always going to come to Emulsion because it just puts everything in place for me. If I look here, you can see I have a lighting plate. I have the normal plates like the detail and the paper softness that are across all of Emulsion, but we've added this lighting plate, which will help us control up or down, how much kind of light and contrast, a little bit of pushing going on there, okay? The wet plate blur, wet plates a lot of times were large format. Sometimes they were very vintage lenses. It's a process that a lot of times had a lot of bokeh, a lot going on. Sometimes the chemicals on the edge of a wet plate aren't covering as well as they are on the center. It just depends on how the maker made it. So even though we have a natural bokeh in this image that we started from color, we have a little bit of extra blurring that can really be used to kind of enhance that. You can turn that layer up and down. You can actually click the mask on that layer. And as always in a mask, white reveals, black conceals. So if I were to go and paint white on different parts of this image with a brush, if I had the mask selected, I could actually bring in or out more blur and get a different effect here, right? But I want to be careful with that. I don't really want to blur her eyes. You can see it's not blurring this like super blurry Gaussian blur. It's not actually adding a bokeh. What it's doing is to help us get a more authentic wet plate look. It's using blending modes, which you can, of course, tweak and tinker and do anything you want with if you really want to get nerdy with it. Then we have the wet mix. Now, this is a very powerful layer in here, and let me show you what I mean. If I take the wet mix layer, if I adjust the wet mix layer, and its default is at 25 right now, but if I turn it up, you can see we kind of get this darker, almost matte. I don't want to say matte because a wet plate is not really a matte image, but it kind of pulls down the highlights. So this layer actually, I feel like, gives us a very authentic piece of control in terms of how wet plate do we want it to be. Now, as you turn this up, you can see that it's darkening the image because it's really pulling back those highlights. Now, you can do something about that. You could manually add layers and mods and tweak with curves. You could adjust the smart curve layer and adjust it to whatever you're liking. But remember the other options up here. These exist throughout all of the effects in Emulsion 4. They're just there, and you can at any time go and click these. A lot of them are for adjusting your tint and your hue, but there's a light boost layer in here. And if you click that light boost, you can actually do kind of an exposure push, which can work really good in this case because our wet plate mix is affecting the overall lightness of the image. So I'm gonna go here. Like I often do, I'm gonna make a snapshot so that I can come back later if I wanna see variations of this. Okay, so here's our look. Here is where we started from the color. Obviously, we could have started from a black and white as well. This was a nice color image. It had good tone to start with. It was processed in Filmist from the raw file. But I didn't use Blackroom or even bring it in as a black and white. I just went straight to Emulsion in this case. And I'm trying to mix that up so that you guys see that you can bring images in a lot of different ways into Emulsion, and each one is going to give you a little bit different result. Emulsion is meant to be very versatile, whether you're combining it with other actions, presets, etc., or using it all by itself. Now, of course, as always, we have a remix. We can do the wet plate grit remix. This is a really good look, I think, that we've created here. But let's run the wet plate grit remix and see what it does. So it's going to change the layers around even more. You can see that instead of just the stain texture mix, it added the scratch glass plate. Now, this is coming into using texture layers, and these wet plates, because we're trying to get that kind of rich organic plate, water staining, things like that, you have those controls. Let me turn off the scratch glass plate for a minute, and let's come back to that water stain plate. That's at 60%, but we can turn it up more. And these plates are seamless plates. You can add any of them here. So this is something we haven't covered that much in depth, but if you add a plate from here, like if I click the whetstone surface, it's going to use those seamless textures we installed, and it's going to apply that over the image, and then we can mask it, we can control the opacity, we can do whatever we want with it. Now, I'm going to go ahead and delete that because I think that one's a little bit too much. With the wet plate and then the wet plate grit remix, what we ended up with here was the stain texture mix and the scratch glass plate. The scratch glass plate does add a bit of extra grittiness, as you see, and oftentimes you see this kind of scratched look along with older images, wet plates, and dry plates that have kind of that patina. You have to decide how distinct you want your texture. So these textures are made from real darkroom images. So the water staining is actually taken from a wet plate, and I've made textures, and those are textures like we see in my Naked Darkroom texture pack. But in the case of Emulsion, you can use still Naked Darkroom textures and have lots of options and other variants. But in Emulsion 4, we have these kind of essential textures built in, and they're built and created as Photoshop patterns that I showed you in the install video. That's why you installed those patterns at the beginning. And what it creates is this seamless texture that just works on any image size and can be built directly into these actions. So if we come back to our image, we can see here, let's turn off scratch glass for just a moment, and you can see the water stain is kind of lightening and darkening and mixing in. And this is actually emulating the water stain kind of texture that you tend to get on a real wet plate because there's actually liquids running, and this water stain texture is taken from an actual wet plate. Now the scratch class is also taken from Real Darkroom, and you can see that it kind of gives you this rough patina edge. Remember, it doesn't have to be everywhere. So there's two ways to turn this up and down. One way is to select the mask and then just to paint black, right? So if you paint black on there, you're going to erase this here. Okay, we're in white. You can see we have white selected here in the swatches. But if I click X and make black my primary swatch, now if I paint this, you can see I'm erasing it, but not permanently. I can do whatever I want with it. Let's turn my opacity of my brush to about 50 and just kind of subtly erase here, because I don't want too much scratching across our skin. I'm more trying to create texture in the shadows. And now you can see that our scratch glass plate, that texture becomes much more subtle and natural feeling. But you can use it however you want. You can turn the opacity up and down. You can mix it with other textures from the actions. There's no limits to how you do this, but ultimately, the wet plate grit remix does give you a bit more intensity. You can see our paper softness is pretty low. Our detail layer is at 100. And so all these things that we're mixing up result in this. Let's go back to our history. I just clicked the little camera icon in the history palette to make a snapshot. And you can see that here was the initial variant of our wet plate collodion, and then here is our more gritty variant. And we can decide which one we like better. This one is a little more subtle, but still has that rich wet plate look. And this one is cool. And we can still come back here, of course, and say, well, let's continue adjusting our wet mix and things like that to make this as intense as we want it, to mix and mask layers. Again, as in all of these, don't get overwhelmed. Feel free to load an image in Photoshop and just run Emulsion and use these out of the box. And the more you use it, as with all actions, I think actions are the gateway to using Photoshop. Because if you're an advanced user, they let you do complex things and layer building and advanced effects really fast. I would just never do this many variables editing images if I didn't have Emulsion 4, because it would be impractical time-wise to build those up every time. But if you're new at Photoshop, or even if you've never used Photoshop, you're going to find that you can come from Lightroom, from Capture One, from wherever you're editing, open an image in Photoshop and just run the actions. And you're going to get these amazing looks. And then the more you get comfortable with it, you're going to start playing with these layers and mods and things like that more, as I showed you. But Emulsion 4 allows you to do all of these different looks, whether you're doing wet plate, whether you're doing cyanotype, whether you're doing selenium, whether you're doing platinum looks, and really get these rich results quickly. And I hope that's what you've learned as we've gone through these different videos of Emulsion 4. If you have any questions, make sure you leave them in the comments. If you need help with Emulsion or setting it up or installing, or you need me to talk about something else, maybe I need to make another video, you can also go to seimfx.com/help and check it out there. And of course, in all of these videos, I'll put a link to Emulsion 4 so you can pick it up yourself and start creating authentic darkroom chemical style emulsions. All right, you guys, peace.